I believe I've said it many times, but I don't know if it's ever been more true than today. We've got a very special show planned. Two of the most respected co-hosts on Crowdsource the Truth coming together for the first time in internet history. We've got David Hawkins joining John Cullen Investigates. John, David, welcome to the show, gentlemen.
Well, happy to be on board. Nice to meet you, John.
Thank you, David. Thank you for coming on the show. This means a lot to me. You're a legend in the industry, and I'm not sure how many of the folks in my audience are familiar with your background, but very much like when we had Dr. Cyril Wecht on the show, Jason. And I said to you, this is kind of a pinch me moment. Dr. Cyril Wecht, right? He's the coroner for Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy and, all the big murders in America, basically. And he came on the show. And so that was like, pinch me moment for me. And it's very similar for me with you. When I started working at Oracle in the late 80s, you were already a legend in the industry. I mean, your papers and the stuff that you wrote in the early 80s, you were like in the same category to me back then as the Ray Kurzweils minus the synthesizers. So when you look at kind of the legends of the industry, there's the big names. You got your Vint Cerfs, you've got the big names, but the truth is that the guys who get a lot of the credit or like the Nicholas Negropontes with Wired and all that. But guys like you actually were doing the systems, actually building that changed the game back in the early 80s. And there's not really a Hall of Fame for guys like you. They don't really have one of those. And again, for me, it's a legendary moment to have you here on the show. So very grateful.
Wow. Well, if I can just say thank you so much. I mean, I never thought that anyone would recognize me, after all these years and buried in the weeds.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, let me tell the audience a little bit about your background, and you can kind of fill in the color. For people who don't watch David's show with Jason, David, I think you went to Cambridge, right? You went to Cambridge, and you have a degree in mechanical engineering. But sort of the thing you became legendary for was a paper that you wrote early in the 80s about artificial intelligence, which is why I kind of categorize you with Kurzweil a little bit. And then you have a patent on the fractal pen. And I don't know if people know about this thing. And, when I heard that you did a show with Jason, my thing in my head was like, oh, David Hawkins, the patent guy. Because I knew you from technology world. Wow. So, if you don't mind indulging the audience just a little bit and just give them a little of the background about the stuff that you did in AI, the stuff that you did at Schlumberger back in the 80s. I mean, that was game-changing stuff. And that's why, for me, having you here to talk about the Winnipeg connection is a big deal. It's a big deal.
Well, thank you so much, John. I'm almost overwhelmed because, buried in this stuff and all of the complexity, I think I have reactions from many people. Their eyes glaze over, right? Because it's pretty heavy stuff and it's so off the wall. And it was breaking the mold because I was working for Schlumberger out in the field, basically liaising between research and production engineering in the field. And I don't know if you're any familiar, but the Schlumberger job is pretty tough. So I got involved in helping to put out oil fires around the world. And I ran a big district in Nigeria for 3 years, which was really challenging for many, many reasons, management point of view. Then Schlumberger invited me to become the head of development engineering at Schlumberger Doll Research in Ridgefield, Connecticut. But for various reasons, for whatever, I was delayed. So I arrived late. And the head of research there, Michel Guyou, he said that particular job has been filled. Would you like to walk around the lab? And I think they had 120 PhDs. So when you drove up at night, the lights on your car glowed a little brighter, all that psychological energy. But I didn't have a PhD. I had a BA Ons Cantab, right? Because Cambridge is weird. They give you an arts degree if you're an engineer. But actually, in retrospect, I think really good engineers are artists. Actually, and I think that's true of every professional domain. Ultimately, you make a transition from the technical knowledge of the domain to the inspirational understanding of the domain, and you perhaps start making great music or whatever. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I arrived there, and at that time, this was the early days of any company adopting AI. Schlumberger had two consultants, Marvin Minsky, who's been seen with images of the young lady with Epstein. Right?
Epstein. Unbelievable.
Right? Yeah. Who was MIT's consultant with Schlumberger, and Ed Feigenbaum, who was the rule-based guy. Right? Mm-hmm. Now, I had worked in Paris, and I'd become very close to their finest petrophysics data interpreter, a guy called André Poupon, where my ex-wife used to work as a secretary. And so I'd had a lot of discussions with André Poupon and watched him go to action on what in Schlumberger we called well logs, which are these data sets for the speed of sound against depth or the resistivity of the rock or the electronic bulk density. And so there's a bunch of squiggles. It's a big data operation in the oil industry. In fact, when I joined, they said data is king, but no one, until I believe I came along, had solved the data problem. Because what happens, and it's very much like crime scene, which is, where we will be talking about, when you arrive in the oil industry, you have geologists, you have petrophysicists, you have reservoir engineers. They all have their special language, and they don't communicate with each other. So a geologist can make an assertion, I think there's a permeability barrier there, and the petrophysicist doesn't see that permeability barrier, so they run into the numerical algorithms, and they generate a flow of oil across the permeability barrier. So the geologist looks at the petrophysicist and said, "You're talking nonsense." So it's a dialogue of the deaf. And what I discovered with André Poupon is he had a model of his brain of the real world constrained by the laws of physics. So I didn't solve the problem immediately, but when I arrived in Ridgefield, I found a gentleman called Luke Steele, who had a double PhD in computational linguistics and knew Noam Chomsky very well, right? And his forehead was about a foot long. He was a wonderful guy. But when he coded the computer, it's like a blur, you see? And I said to Luke, could you build a replica or something that looks to a layperson like the brain of a geologist? And he had no fear at that age, basically. So I started with him programming into the computer a virtual formation, if you will, that could be driven by an assertion from a geologist, a petrophysicist, or a geophysicist. And that was what my paper was about. And then
that paper, so this is the pivotal paper. So, Jason, I don't know if the audience can see this. Can you pull up the paper so the audience can see it, Jason?
Yeah.
So this is the one.
This is the analysis of expert thinking by David Charles Hawkins in the January 1983 International Journal of Man-Machine Studies.
Yeah. So when I was at Oracle, this was already one of the watershed papers.
Good heavens. And I'm amazed.
This was already one of the, again, that's what I'm saying. This was like Negroponte, Ray Kurzweil. Yeah. You're talking about Turing level guys. You're talking about Vint Cerf. You're talking about these are the legends. So this was the legendary paper.
Well, I'm totally amazed.
Well, here's the thing that all right. So most people who didn't work in the world that my world wasn't exactly like yours, but I did very complex systems for financial services and for pharmaceuticals,
right.
But not really energy. I never really did deep stuff in the energy world. But what most people watching don't probably know is that Schlumberger is very similar in some ways to Goldman Sachs in the way they protect proprietary technology and proprietary intellectual property. And what I mean by that is if you are IBM or you are Oracle and you're trying to sell to Schlumberger or you're trying to sell to Goldman Sachs, they're two of the hardest companies in the world to sell to. because they do things their way to keep it proprietary and to give themselves an advantage. And back in the 80s, they were just notorious. Like if you worked at IBM or you worked at Hewlett Packard or you worked at Oracle, you worked at one of the big companies, Sun Micro, we all knew that the bar at Schlumberger, the bar at Goldman Sachs, they were two of the toughest teams to convince to do anything commercial because they had guys like you.
Well,
that's why, because they had guys like you to figure out stuff that was game-changing that was not available in the commercial world. And so there you go.
Well, that's astonishing, you see, because you're looking from the outside and making some very flattering comments, and I'm looking from the inside. And I guess you could say, back in 1981, I'm naively innocent but fairly smart, right? So I arrive in this place in good faith. I find Luke Steels with the foot-long forehead, wonderful guy, blurry, double PhD, whatever that means in computational linguistics. And instinctively, he knew what I wanted to do. I can't program a computer, but that was the gift of God, right? Because then I was able, with him, to develop a prototype that you could drive with assertions that never took control away from you. So I, as a petrophysicist or emulating a geologist, could make my geological statements, and the system would then learn, understand, and this is key, propagate the effects as though my hypothesis was true in the context of the model that had currently created inside the computer. And I'm saying this is essentially what an expert does. He doesn't tell you you're right or wrong. He says, these would be the consequences if your hypothesis was correct.
With varying degrees of certainty, right? Yes, and you have varying degrees of certainty for each one of the nodes.
Yes. So what an expert does, he generates an expectation, what I call a propagation of an effect, which would be the data. So, for example, if I say this is a hydrocarbon-bearing sandstone reservoir rock, and that's the speed of sound, right? If I make that hypothesis, it generates a synthetic speed of sound that would be true if that formation was
right.
And then it throws up on the screen, and this is absolutely fundamental, what the computer thinks it would look like from the speed of sound point of view, and superimposes that on the actual speed of sound generated by a Schlumberger well log. So you get a differential where basically if there's a difference, it's telling you your hypothesis is wrong. The expert isn't telling you that you're wrong. They're saying your hypothesis, if this model is correct, right? And then the system I went on to say was resolution of conflict between the propagated effects from the model and the actual empirical data measured from the formation. And
let me see if I can put this into terms.
David is describing his system of ground truthing, of comparing the conclusion of the computer to the actual truth and moving the model closer to the real world. And this is the exact method that he uses every Friday on our show, Reverse CSI. David is reverse engineering crime scene investigations. And we also forgot to mention, although he's British, David currently lives in Canada and is a Canadian citizen and has been doing amazing research into all of the really inexplicable things that have been going on at this Winnipeg lab, Dr. Chu, all this stuff that now finally is being spoken about. Rand Paul has been asking in the Senate of Dr. Fauci, what the hell is going on with this gain of function research? Did you send money to this Wuhan lab? Fauci's getting nervous. This is really going to be the focus of our show and this new collaboration today. Perhaps we should talk a little bit about some of this stuff, guys.
Well, this is the exciting part. So, one of the things I get excited about, David, is when I have a discovery in my little cave doing my thing. And then Jason says, Hawkins was talking about that like 2-3 weeks ago. And I'm like, really? And it turns out that independently, we kind of came to similar conclusions. And, like in the world of astronomy, you look for that, right? If you've got an astronomer in Australia and an astronomer in Chile and they have the same observation,
Independent corroboration.
that's what you're looking for, right? So when I heard that how deep you guys had been going into this thing with Dr. Chu and the Winnipeg thing, I got excited because to me, David, it was clear that this was a key component in the story and that you couldn't even begin a conversation about Wuhan without talking about Winnipeg.
Right.
And in the systems that I was doing, a lot of what we did in my earlier part of my career was root cause analysis. And so we're constantly looking for what is the real root cause of this, right? So when I hear Rand Paul and I hear, I guess it was also Tucker Carlson during the week was going on about it, talking about the Wuhan lab, if something was in the Wuhan lab, maybe we should be looking at where did it come from? How did it get to Wuhan? And this is where you were in front of this aspect of the story 18 months ago. I mean, I think it was January, February last year that you were bringing up this whole thing with Dr. Chu and what had happened in the summer of 2019. So, Jason, we have a video clip from CBC News in Canada of Dr. Chu and Gary Kobinger being awarded the Governor's Award. Right? Now, these are not the golden poo awards. These are different. This
well,
was
now
the
I have a lot of
governor's.
videos from you here, and we've also got George's brother agitating in the chat. I think he's irritated that he's going to be embarrassed in court very soon. Which one of these videos do we want to be looking at?
I think it says Dr. Chu and Governor and Gary Kobinger is in the title of the video. And this was a renowned scientist working in Winnipeg, getting awards. You're going to see an award-winning video of her. It's in the Dr. Chu folder.
Got it. Yeah, it's got to be this one, right? This is the only one in that folder.
Yeah. So they're winning an award. This is from the governor's thing. She is renowned, and this Gary Kobinger guy, and she worked on the Ebola vaccines.
Mm.
Now, the reason this will become relevant, we'll come back to this in a second, but for the audience who doesn't know who we're talking about, Dr. Chu, this is the connection between the research that David's been doing and the research that I've been doing. It meets at Dr. Chu. That's the intersection. So let's play this clip so everybody knows who we're talking about and how revered she was before the Royal Canadian Mounted Police showed up in the summer of 2019. So, Jason, do you get the clip?
Yep. They escorted her out of the lab.
Doctors Kobinger and Chiu created ZMapp to treat patients with the Ebola virus. ZMapp comprises a cocktail of monoclonal antibody therapies that act like missiles, targeting the outer shell of the Ebola virus, preventing it from replicating. Ces premières applications chez les humains ont permis d'obtenir le rétablissement complet de 2 missionnaires médicaux et de 25 premiers répondants et résidents durant l'épidémie d'Ebola de 2014 au Libéria. Depuis ce temps, le ZMapp sert de modèle pour les études sur l'efficacité des thérapies par anticorps monoclonaux pour lutter contre d'autres pathogènes infectieux comme le VIH, le virus Lassa et le virus Marburg.
My name is Gary Kobinger. I'm the director of the Infectious Disease Research Center at Université Laval. Well, Ebola is considered by many the most dangerous pathogen. I started working with the Ebola envelope and realizing that some of the Ebola glycoproteins, so the coat protein of the virus, that were a very good candidate for vaccine. I knew about Chu's project on the antibody, and it was very interesting at the time because nobody believed that this could work. Instead of trying to prevent entry of the virus and infection, we're gonna let the infection settle and start. And then we're gonna give the antibody. And the beauty of this is because they build their own defenses, after that you can re-expose them and they are protected, like a vaccine. When we finally saw the success rate of the treatment, we were amazed. That was a great moment I will never forget. And I mean, I remember we were jumping in the suit. What's scary with Ebola is that it kills within days. The West African outbreak was worse than a worst case scenario. It was global. When we were there, we had a request in Liberia. 2 people that were just found positive. One of the infected individual is actually a physician. He decided to use the treatment and saw a strong improvement, and both of them survived. It was quite a moment, because this approach now is being used by everybody that is working on the pathogen. I think this is going to play a very important role.
I was really, really happy. My little son, he was so excited as well. He said, "Oh, my mom, found a cure for Ebola."
John, I hope we don't get struck for playing that video. There's a couple guests that love to play videos that are likely to get us struck.
No, that's fair use. This is educational. So now people understand.
I mean, it's just more. Everything I'm doing is fair use, but it's more talking to lawyers about it. Hopefully, these French people don't mind us showing and commenting on their video. What about that video do you think was most relevant to the conversation?
Well, this is Dr. Chu, right? So Dr. Chu is revered for the work she did on Ebola with Gary Kobinger. They win all kinds of awards, but they don't win Queen of the Prom. Queen of the Prom goes to remdesivir. And ZMAP is pushed to the side because they're not part of the club. They're not part of the clique. And Gary Kobinger is given the stiff arm. And remdesivir with Dr. Fauci is given the opportunity to become the Queen of the Prom and fails. Remdesivir is not approved for the treatment of Ebola and does not receive FDA approval. It does, however, receive FDA approval for therapeutic treatment of coronavirus, of SARS-CoV-2. So although remdesivir was not considered effective for that which it was designed for, it was approved for something that it was not necessarily designed for, and that the WHO still does not recommend remdesivir. So although the FDA has approved it, the WHO takes issue with that. So I'm not sure which side of the fence the president or Dr. Walensky falls on that. But this notion that this woman was on the team to develop the Ebola vaccine or the Ebola therapeutic with Gary Kobinger, wins all these awards, and then I'm going to flip it to David because, I wouldn't know Royal Canadian Mounted Police if I tripped over them, but they show up.
You could recognize them by the funny suits.
But you have to kind of understand something. This is almost the equivalent of the FBI showing up and arresting Fauci. This woman is legendary in the world of virology.
But
she is a legend.
They just
all right. So this is again. I'm not
David,
Canadian. I don't know what the hell's going. Yeah. So I don't know what the hell happened up there. So David, go. Yeah.
She was escorted off the premises by the RCMP, and she seems to have disappeared. But the general theory is she popped up in Wuhan City. Right now, this reverse crime scene investigation, which I basically lifted as a technique from the oil industry, because I'm saying an oil field interpretation and a crime scene investigation, they're one and the same. It's just a different data set, and your models are different. And of course, if you're in a crime scene and you hope one day to prosecute and get a conviction, you're looking for a mens rea, which is much more subtle than an actus rea. That is to say, the act associated with the crime, the physical, right? But the motive behind it, it may be across a spectrum from negligence, recklessness, willfulness, fraudulence to outright criminality, that you want to kill people with this virus. So it's very dangerous to prejudge what you're going to find in terms of mens rea. And one of the great strategic mistakes people, they try and take it into the criminal court before they've got all of the evidence. And I call it reverse O.J. Simpson. With O.J. Simpson, they went and tried to get a murder conviction prematurely, right? Mm-hmm. And eventually the family of Nicole Simpson's boyfriend sued Simpson for wrongful death and won.
Mm-hmm.
And the beauty of that approach is it's a balance of probability argument, right? 51%, and it's in the civil courts, right? So, and you get discovery. So and I've emphasized this for as long as I've been in the business, back to 911 and even before, like at the Picton Pig Farm, don't go into the criminal courts. Go for wrongful death in the civil courts where you get discovery, and then that doesn't preclude bringing a criminal action later, but it does allow you to start nibbling away at these people's money. And they've got a lot of money, like trillions of dollars, right?
Certainly.
Right? And a wise friend of mine said millionaires shouldn't argue with billionaires, and billionaires shouldn't argue with trillionaires. So whilst we think that billionaire Bill Gates is powerful, the people who own the controlling shareholders in Microsoft are these exchange-traded funds I've been talking about now for a long time with Jason, where very quickly from a timeline point of view, you have State Street, which was established in 1792 under a charter from the Massachusetts governor, John Hancock, who's a storied figure in the history of the United States, right? And then in 1975, Vanguard is started up, and that's the year that Maximus is established. And in 1988, BlackRock starts up. And BlackRock, that was the year they founded the Family Maintenance Enforcement Program in British Columbia, which I think basically deploys a group of extortionists inside the families of the Five Eyes countries. And the point is they can extract money from, let's say, the right-hand side of the family, from child support, and then extort concessions from the other side of the family, which are told, we will withhold your benefits unless you do what we want you to do. So the Office of Economic
Or your
Opportunity,
passport or whatever.
or driving license. So the Office of Economic Opportunity in 1970, which is where I believe the modern eugenics, Fabianism begins, the Office of Economic Opportunity in the United States basically started a program to fund the sterilization of women.
Hold on. Before we go there, I want to talk about Dr. Chu. All right.
Okay. All right.
So let's go
That's what I wanted to say.
yeah.
We want to make sure we don't go too far.
Okay.
Right.
Let's go back to Dr. Whatever.
All right.
Now,
All right. So I want to give you just one observation, something I said to Jason when we first found out about what was happening in Winnipeg. You had already been talking about it for 2 or 3 weeks when I first found out about her. So you were ahead of this. But I made a comment to Jason because Jason and you had been talking about spike proteins and patents in spike proteins. Okay. And I didn't know anything about this. And Jason and I are doing a show one day, and Jason starts throwing out all this glycoprotein spike stuff. And I'm like, where the hell do you find this? And I'm figuring, he had to be talking to Hawkins. So he starts pulling up all this spike protein patent stuff. And we're looking at, Jason, I guess, is showing me, what was it, Jason? The patented proteins, was it on Ebola, on HIV,
No,
both of them? It was both, I think.
Is that the Pirbright Institute coronavirus patent?
Yes.
No. I think this was from the paper from the Indian guys who said that there was an uncanny similarity.
That was one piece of evidence. But what we started to realize, or what you showed me, were patented spike proteins. I think with Dr. Fauci's name on them. I guess they must have been HIV then. So they were HIV. Right.
It's got to do with this paper that they forced them to withdraw that came out early, the uncanny similarity of unique inserts in the 2019 novel coronavirus spike protein. And they're similar to the HIV glycoprotein 120. And yes, there was some Fauci-connected thing here. Dr. Mikovits spoke. We're right now squarely in the territory of stuff that is going to get us super struck. So we should be careful as we speak about this, because I don't want the John E. Hoover YouTube channel to get taken out. We've got 232 people watching us there.
I'll keep it in the lines.
Not yet subscribe to the John E. Hoover channel, make your way over there. I also want to let our users know about David's website, which is reversecciscripts.com. And of course, some of these things that frankly, the Constitution allows us to talk about, tells us that our Creator has bestowed us with these inalienable rights, including the freedom of speech. YouTube wants to alienate those rights, but we will be talking about it in less than half an hour when we continue this discussion on the sponsor-exclusive segment on Subscribestar.com and Patreon.com/IamJohnCullen. We'll have a special simulcast today for David's sponsors on Subscribestar and Patreon/Reverse CSI. And of course, Crowdsource the Truth subscribers will see it on Patreon and Subscribestar for Crowdsource the Truth. But there is something that appears to be going on with these glycoproteins. We just can't really discuss it here.
Well, hang on. I just want to share with David a comment that I made to you about a year ago, a little bit more, because you introduced me to the notion via David that there was even a patentable spike protein. You know, before coronavirus showed up, who would have even been having that conversation about, you know, patents on spike proteins on viruses? Prior to, you know, February 2020, that was not in anybody's vernacular unless you worked at NIH. But because of David's, you know, world of patents, so to speak, you guys started talking about it. You got me educated on it. You came on one of the shows, on, you know, one of our Friday shows, and you started to tell me about these patented glycoproteins. And my audience is learning secondhand from the stuff that you got from David. And we're looking at all this stuff. And I made a comment to you. And I said, if it turns out that therapeutically an Ebola treatment works against SARS-CoV-2, we have got to go back to Winnipeg.
Absolutely.
Now, David, if remdesivir was remotely effective, which the FDA says it is, Jason, right? So the FDA says remdesivir is the only one.
Trump take it?
I think they did give it to Trump, yeah, along with the other stuff. I think they gave Trump everything under the sun, quite frankly. I think they gave him the whole gamut, so you know, get better. But the notion that remdesivir was even considered, think about this, David. Why didn't they consider the chickenpox vaccine, you know, the measles shot? Why would the Ebola therapeutic work on a coronavirus? Well, unless the spike proteins were remarkably similar. I don't know. This is back to you.
Outside of our area, John. I mean, this is touching on medical analysis and stuff. Let me pause the answer to that question for a second, because I just want to show you guys.
Give you a timeline.
Before you do, Dave, I just want to show you. Before you do, David, I just want to make sure we cover this, because there's this fact check from Reuters, which is checking a fact that is not compatible with anything that we ever said or that I'm aware of anybody ever saying. This is saying Pirbright Institute does not have a patent for a COVID-19 vaccine. I could agree with that. The patent that we were talking about was on the virus, not the vaccine. Absolutely. Right, David?
Yes. And there's the phraseology, and that's what I find so interesting about patents, because it's a dry language that has to prove to the patent examiner, which incidentally Americans should understand is a British company called Serco, which is processing patents and has processed 4 million plus of the last US patent applications, which is kind of weird, but I'll come back to that. If you go into the language of that patent, it talks about a coronavirus and it talks about reverse genetics. Right? Yes. And essentially that's an artificial intelligence tool that looks at the genetic makeup of the virus and tweaks it and plays with it, right? And then you're one step away from what's known as gain of function research, right? Where basically the lab undertakes, and there was a moratorium in funding that was lifted on the 21st of December 2017, 1 week after Barry Sherman was murdered in Toronto, right? Oh, and you and I, Jason, we've looked at that and said, Barry Sherman was a highly litigious, brilliant man who understood the inners and outers of the big pharma industry, particularly the use of submarining and continuation patent applications.
And he was hated. Understand who he is. The audience may not know who Barry Sherman is and what he was doing. So for people who are like, who's Barry Sherman and what was his wife? They don't even know about the murder and how weird the murder was, right? So I mean, the Barry Sherman story is a big part of this. But again, I don't want to lose track of this thread, Jason, about
Yeah.
the patented spike proteins and this notion of if a therapeutic for Ebola were to work on this SARS-CoV-2, wouldn't that be like a strange coincidence? And lo and behold, remdesivir, an Ebola drug, is the chosen drug to treat the SARS-CoV-2. To me, David, that puts a bit of culpability back on Dr. Chu. So when we look at Dr. Chu and we say, was she or wasn't she trafficking effectively? And I'm not saying she was or wasn't, I don't know. But was she moving SARS-CoV-2 viruses back and forth between Winnipeg and Wuhan? That's the $64 million question.
Right. Let me just
ahead.
address that, because timeline is now critical. So on the 13th of December, 2017, Barry and Honey Sherman, man and wife, were murdered in a bizarre ritualistic fashion beside the swimming pool in their house and this man was worth $3.5 billion. He was the founder of Apotex. He was beyond brilliant. But anyway, they were hanged side by side with their feet away from the pool. And the media and the police that arrived immediately said, this is a murder homicide, right? Now, they were planning to take a holiday. She was a fairly
murder-suicide.
woman. Yeah, a murder-suicide, right? And she was 140 pounds. He had a bad back. So logically, one would say, why the hell they're planning to go on holiday together? He's worth $3.5 billion. Everyone says that they loved each other and he had lots and lots to live for. And then 6 weeks later, the family got a second post-mortem or autopsy done, and they noticed there were cuff marks on their wrists, so that they had been cuffed with plastic straps, right? And I think they were hanged side by side, feet, so that there would be the maximum amount of humiliation, because that's what these scumbags love. And
I heard that they were
filmed. They were filmed. They were posed. The crime scene was dressed, right? The witnesses were all told to keep shut. And then there would be a snuff film somewhere that is sent to anyone else who wants to get up against Big Pharma and take them on through their patent trees or patent cliffs or whatever it is. So now let's back up. I think when or if he'd still been alive, when they lifted the funding moratorium on gain of function research on the 21st of December, 2017, had he been alive, he would have said, I know exactly what these people are going to do, right? They're going to start developing pathogens that can be used to cull certain target populations where we think, for example, under the Obamacare Affordable Care Act, seniors are too expensive. So let's develop a virus that gets rid of seniors, right? And I think Jason sent me a link the other day that showed a major drop in claims through the Affordable Care Act because seniors are being dying off as a result of the virus that I think has been tuned to kill them.
David, let me ask you this, because this concept of reverse genetics, it's reverse engineering. I'm thinking with artificial intelligence, it's basically known that if you are getting involved in computer learning and you show the computer just multiple examples of what it is that you're trying to teach it, it eventually just sort of figures that out, right? So if you're saying this genetic combination is deadly it can sort out, artificial intelligence can find through reverse genetics some sort of pathogen that targets a specific group, right?
Or can let me give you guys a counter argument to that. Let me give you the absolutely Peter Rabbit simple, no artificial intelligence needed. If you open up the deck, open up the deck I sent you, there's one or two charts, and it is the breakdown of
Just before we get to that, because we will in a second, I just wanted to address this thing about the fact check, which said that the Pirbright Institute does not have a patent on the coronavirus vaccine. This is a U.S. patent issued November 2018 to the Pirbright Institute for coronavirus, we see right there. And in the abstract, which the Pirbright Institute paid some fancy lawyer to write, I didn't write this. David, did you write this?
Mm-hmm.
It says the present invention provides a live attenuated, weakened coronavirus comprising a variant replicase gene encoding polyproteins, comprising a mutation in one or more of the non-structural proteins. The coronavirus may be used as a vaccine for treating and or preventing a disease such as infectious bronchitis. So I don't know what Reuters is talking about. This would seem to indicate...
No, I do.
They do.
I know exactly what they're doing. Yeah. So what Reuters does is they say that they don't have a patent on this vaccine. And nobody ever said that. Nobody said that they have a patent on this vaccine. We said that the Pirbright Institute has patents that relate to coronaviruses, and coronaviruses are mentioned in their patents. That's all. Now, let's talk about that, because the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is not an mRNA vaccine. It's the old style, right? Adenovirus. And that's how they were using coronaviruses. It's important that people understand this. Inert coronaviruses are used to deliver normal influenza vaccines. Your seasonal influenza vaccine, the way the influenza gets into the cell is inside a coronavirus. That's why they do it in the eggs. That's why they were growing it in eggs.
The envelope, right?
It's avian, right? So the avian nature of the egg allows the flu and the coronavirus, and basically they're using the coronavirus to get into the cell. And this was when you turned me on to all the patents from Moderna. I remember the first time because you learned it with David. David showed it to you, and then you showed it to me. And you were showing me the Moderna patents on how they were doing it. And basically that it was this mechanical replacement for the inert coronavirus.
Oh, you mean the nanotech stuff that was
Yeah. That's what the mRNA, that's what the Moderna has. The Moderna technology is the package, right? It's the clamshell thing that they can put stuff in.
Wow.
It is replacing the inert coronaviruses in the Pirbright patent that they were growing in the eggs.
Whoops. John? We'll take this moment of pause to say that we're super likely to get struck for even mentioning any of this stuff, but it's totally fine. You cut out there for a second, John.
All right. So again, none of this stuff is this isn't suspicious stuff. In other words, for years, they use inert coronaviruses in it says it in the vaccine for influenza, the seasonal influenza vaccines. That's how they work. That's not like a mystery, or that's like documented. So,
would you like me,
and then
John, I think I'd like to get, if I may, go down that timeline that you're talking about with this woman who was escorted off the premises, because the timeline is very critical. So on the 13th of December 2017, Barry and Honey Sherman are murdered in this bizarre ritualistic way, where the level of gratuitous cruelty for me is designed to produce a snuff film that can be then shown to people who might do what Barry Sherman was doing, which was sue Big Pharma for, I don't know, patent frauds, or, it was illegal to do the continuation. He was removed. So on the 21st of December of 2017, the moratorium on funding gain-of-function research was lifted. And I'm alleging at the Level 4 lab in Winnipeg, they then started working on tuning the pathogen to take out specific communities in the target population, right? In those days, they worked on, for example, H1N1, which I understand targeted young people, right?
Hang on. No, you're right. And I want to back up what you're saying. So, Jason, in the deck is the chart that supports what David just said. But my point is, it's just not that complicated. And now go to the one with the chart. Keep going. Next one. Next chart. Next one. Next one. Next one. Next one. Next one. Next one. There we go. Oh, that was race. All right. Well, this is race. So let's look at this just for a second. This is the racial breakdown of deaths by COVID, and it matches the population distribution within 1% by, white, black, Hispanic, Asian. There's nothing there. It's like a perfect match. What I did see was that the COVID deaths in most age groups were killing twice as many men as women. But Jason, one of the slides I thought I had was the one that shows the ages, where you see that like more than 75% of the people who've died are over 75 years old. Yeah. You don't need artificial intelligence to target a 75-year-old and older population if you have pandemic influenza. You don't need artificial intelligence. You just need the virus. The virus will do it for you. The virus has plenty of intelligence in and of itself that you don't need a computer. If you want to kill people over 75, you release the only BL4 influenza virus on Earth. Or it gets released accidentally. Now, the issue with SARS-CoV-2, David, is SARS-CoV-2 hasn't killed that many people itself. So, in other words, if we go and we look at Korea or we look at Taiwan, Taiwan doesn't have 15 people dead on an island of 24.5 million people. So the question is, did SARS-CoV-2 really kill all these people, or was it something else? And so what I do is I go to Shanghai, where there aren't 10 people dead. And I look in Beijing, where there aren't 10 people dead. And I look in Taiwan, where there aren't 15. And I go to Vietnam, that has a population larger than Germany, larger than the UK. Vietnam is 100 million people, more than any country in Western Europe, and there aren't 50 dead. So my question is, if that's the case, maybe SARS-CoV-2 isn't as deadly as we were told. And maybe the project that Fauci funded that we should be talking about was the resurrection of the 1918 Spanish flu. Because, go ahead.
What's that, David?
Okay, so let me just say, and we had that show, earlier in the day, Jason. There's another explanation. You see, I made the comment, and maybe that offends certain people, that people like Bill Gates are technically sophisticated, but scientifically illiterate. Now, that may be rather tough, right? But what I'm saying, and John has made some very flattering comments about my career in Schlumberger. But remember, one of the points I made about an expert is, in their minds, they create a clone of the real world that obeys the laws of physics. That is to say, when you program a computer with a hypothesis, it has an infinite search space if it doesn't understand the laws of physics. That is to say, oil does not cross an impermeable barrier, right? Now, an expert in this area would not allow oil to cross an impermeable barrier. But
in their thought process, you mean?
Well, exactly. They would exclude it because, and then they would explain to a layperson, well, you can't put oil that way and get into the borehole because there's an impermeable barrier between it and you've got to frack it, or you've got to break it down, or you've got to create a connection. And that's the beauty of an expert. They explain to you exactly what you need to know in your language, so you can take the appropriate action. So now with this, the challenge is, of course, with the Obamacare, it introduced a method that would be extremely expensive for the people funding Obamacare if the seniors continue to live long lives and sucking on Obamacare, right, with all the expensive medical treatments. So one way of addressing that, of course, is to adjust the infection amongst the seniors so they reduce their claims on Obamacare. And there's two ways of doing that. One is perhaps implied with some expensive genetics. As John says, you don't need particularly to remove seniors. But what about having a family or a community of asymptomatic carriers that are basically extortionists who wittingly or unwittingly go to the Wuhan city food market and spread the virus by contacting or smearing it on working surfaces? So you create a hotspot. Now, the fascinating thing from my approach is when Dr. Hannah Fry made that documentary with the BBC called Contagion! She starts by showing this pandemic app that is downloaded on mobiles. And she goes into a little town called Hazelmere in southern England, and she said, I am patient zero, right? And a whole bunch, maybe 500 people in Hazelmere had volunteered with their mobiles to have that app downloaded. And that app was basically, when it sensed that, let's say, Dr. Hannah Fry had spent more than a minute, less than 6 feet away from someone else with the mobile, the infection was transmitted, not transported, because it's a digital virus, into the other machine that then was collated with the data. So at the end of the day or the exercise, they could simulate how this kind of digital virus might spread. But the digital virus is not a physical virus, right? Now, what has happened in 2018 is, I believe, the pandemic app built by the BBC leaked into the Event 201 exercise at the Hotel Pierre in New York, Event 201, sponsored by Johns Hopkins University and Bill Gates, right? To create.
Now, gentlemen, I'm sorry to interject, but we are just moments away from the transition to our historic sponsor exclusive show, where the three of us will continue this conversation on subscribestar.com and patreon.com/reversecsi for David's sponsors. On subscribestar.com and patreon.com, I am John Cullen for subscribers to John Cullen. And of course, on Subscribestar and Patreon/crowdsource the truth. We really have to make the transition in seconds. So anything anybody wants to say that can take less than a minute, John?
I'm looking
Both
forward to it.
Both of you are bad at this, by the way.
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to it. This is great. I want to keep going, so I'm looking forward to making the transition, and we've got a lot more to get into.
And let me just make my little less than a minute. So on the 18th of October, 2019 was the day the Event 201 in New York opened. And on the 18th of October, 2019, the Wuhan City Military Games opened in Wuhan City, when athletes were complaining that they got COVID-type symptoms. So I think
we're going to look. We're going to look at the Surgeon General's letter. We have the Surgeon General's memo about the athletes being sick that we got from Rebel News from Ezra, and we're going to be looking at that when we get to our patron-only hour, Jason. So I've got that document. We're going to go through that, and this is from the Surgeon General. Yeah,
it is a remarkable coincidence that both of these things happened on the same day. We'll be back in just a moment. I'm looking forward to seeing all of our viewers on Patreon and Subscribestar. Thanks for watching, everybody.